Hi everyone, my name is Apura Reddy and I'm from the World Bank Solutions for Youth Employment team, which is part of the Social Protection and Jobs group at the bank. Uh, Achieving general equality in access to good jobs is not straightforward, as women struggle to overcome a multitude of social, cultural, and economic barriers. According to the World Bank Gender Strategy 2024-2030, women labor force participation has plateaued since 1990 at 53%, with the largest gaps in lower middle income countries. Women in the workforce earn 77 cents for every dollar that men earn. Youth employment is higher among women than among men. What can we do to address this persistent occupational segregation that clusters women in low paying jobs? What can we do? How do we enable women to participate equally in better paying male dominated professions? We, the World Bank S4YE, the Solutions for Youth Employment team, turned to other World Bank teams to learn how they were dealing with this challenge. The Women in Unconventional Jobs Learning series highlights programs that focus on women in non traditional jobs, jobs that are often male dominated. Today, we have Natalia Mazoni. So excited to have you, Natalia, uh, from a private sector specialist at the World Bank, who is a co-author of the report that launched the Women, Business and Law 10th edition, a series of annual studies measuring the enabling environment for women's economic opportunity in 190 economies. The report sets a new frontier for measuring environment for women's economic inclusion across three pillars: legal frameworks, measuring laws, supporting frameworks, measuring policy mechanisms to implement laws, expert opinions, shedding light on experts' perception of women's outcomes. Natalia, with that introduction, welcome. We are so excited for you to share some key insights from this very important report.
Hi, Apurva. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk a little bit about our work at Women, Business, and the Law. I'm going to share my screen so we can jump right into it. For those of you who are not familiar, Women, Business, and the Law is a project within the World Bank that over the past 15 years has analyzed laws that affect women's lives around the world with one goal, which is to measure how laws or lack of laws affect women's economic opportunities. So since 2020, we have presented an index that covers 190 economies, and up until last year, 2023, the report measured countries' progress towards gender equality in the law through 8 indicators. And these indicators were built around a woman's key interactions with the law through the life cycle. Now, this year, in the 2024 report that we published in March, we expanded the measures in several ways, and the goal was to set a new frontier to measure women's rights. So first, we expanded the legal index to assess critical areas where change is needed the most by adding 2 new indicators. So we added an indicator on women's safety and another one on childcare services. And also we refined existing indicators. But we also wanted to take a step further and analyze the actual implementation of laws. So in addition to measuring the legal frameworks, as Apurva mentioned in the introduction, this year's report presents new data on the frameworks that support the implementation of these laws. So for example, the existence of national policies, institutions, services, budgets, guidelines, and data. And finally, to get a fuller picture of women's rights in real life, we asked experts in selected countries about their opinions, their perceptions on the outcomes of the law for women in practice. For example, do women have freedom of movement? Do women have access to equal pay? Do they actually enjoy equal pay? Do they actively join the labor market in the sectors that we cover? And then we heard the opinion of these experts and we incorporated that in our new index. So that's just a little overview of how the new index is looking like in 2024. And with these new measurements, what we found was that the legal gender gap is in fact much wider than we previously thought. While we have been reporting that women have only 3/4 of the legal rights afforded to men, When we factor in the gaps that we identified in safety and childcare, which is the two new indicators, we find now that in reality, women have only 2/3 of the legal rights of men. And this underscores the enduring challenges that are faced by women worldwide. Their ability to freely and safely choose where to go and where to work, to access equal opportunities to enter and remain in the labor market, to manage their time, their careers, and even caretaking responsibilities. So here I bring data from the World Bank's Gender Data Portal, and we can observe a consistent trend in global female force participation over the past 3 decades. Apurva, you also mentioned that in your introduction about how the women's labor force participation has plateaued over the past few decades. So we see that globally, female labor force participation has remained relatively unchanged, with approximately half of working age women engaging in the labor force. While the overall trend remains flat, there are significant disparities within regions. So we see that in 5 out of the 7 regions here on the screen, over half of women aged 15 to 64 years, which is the active working age, participate in the labor market. But we see, for example, that in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa, this figure drops to a quarter or less. So despite the consistency in male participation rates, which is around 80% globally, there is a notable disparity in female participation rates, and males are consistently outnumbering females workers. And here, just to clarify, on the graph shown on the screen, the male rates are the lines on the top and the female rates are the lines on the bottom. So the gender gap in labor force, it's striking. And this trend only reinforces the need to accelerate gender equality, reform unequal laws, introduce gender-sensitive policies, and that is to enable women to realize their full economic potential and increase female labor force participation and hopefully change this trend that we've been seeing over the years. Now, I want to tell you a quick story just to contextualize the data that I'm going to present. In Chile, and in some countries in Latin America, there was a myth that women could not enter an underground mine because they bring bad luck to the mine. But in 1988, Alejandra Arevalo became the first female geologist to defy this long-standing myth that entering an underground mine brought bad luck. So she did that, and she was the first female to enter an underground mine in Chile. And at the time, women in the country, they were not allowed, they were legally forbidden from working in the mining industry. And that is a restriction that was only removed from the labor legislation in Chile 5 years later, in 1993. So the removal of these restrictions at the time were aimed to promote more gender equality and also boost female participation in the mining sector in Chile. But there were some initial concerns over safety and cultural norms, for example. But over the years following Alejandra's example, more women in Chile have entered this traditionally male-dominated sector. So we see from recent data from the Chilean mining workforce study shows that there was a significant increase over the years. So women now comprise 15% of the mining workforce, and that's data from 2022, up from 8% in 2018 and just 5.2% in 2007. So we see a considerable increase over time since these reforms were introduced. And data from our latest Women, Business, and the Law report show that 70 countries around the world impose at least one restriction on the jobs that women can perform, either at night or jobs that are deemed dangerous or sectoral or industrial jobs. And specifically, 20 economies impose at least 20 economies prohibit a woman from working at night, 45 prohibit a woman from working in jobs deemed dangerous, and 59 economies still prohibit a woman from working in certain industries such as agriculture, construction, energy, manufacturing, mining, transportation, and water. And these restrictions to the jobs that women can perform are widespread. We see here the distribution in the regions. You can see in the screen how these restrictions are distributed among the regions. We see that the larger restrictions are identified in the Middle East and North Africa region, also in South Asia. Several of these restrictions are still present in the Sub-Saharan Africa region. And we see a trend in high-income OECD countries having less restrictions to the jobs that women can do. And in this next slide, I bring just some examples of these jobs that women cannot perform in the countries that we have identified. So in 59 countries, women are prohibited from performing certain tasks in industrial jobs. So we see, for example, that women in Dominica cannot work in transformation and transmission of electricity. We also see that in Eswatini and Lesotho, women cannot work in underground mines. So these restrictions are widespread and they're sometimes very specific to the tasks and jobs that women can perform. So this is just a way to illustrate how these job restrictions are still widespread, but also how they impact women's ability to enter these often higher-paying jobs that are more male-dominated. And I mean, of course, I'm happy to circulate the slide if you want to share that, Apurva, because there's a lot of interesting information here.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, Natalia, if I can take a quick second and pause and ask you a question,
Of course.
many of these, am I right to understand that some of these, professions and industries look quite dangerous even for men and women, right? So do we want to increase participation? Isn't this safe or unsafe for both to participate in, for example, underground mining, maintenance and repairing, ducts and sewers, and working with fertilizers and insecticides.
Right. Yeah, so that's a question that we often get. And the restrictions to women's work in these industries and the sectors that we measure at Women, Business, and the Law, they're largely the result of laws that are in place, but they still reflect outdated safety standards. These restrictions are also due to historically wide acceptance of certain outdated, but now abrogated International Labor Organization conventions on women's work. So, for example, Convention number 45 is the Convention on Underground Work for Women. And that convention by the International Labor Organization recommended the prohibition of employing women in underground work. But that one has been classified as outdated, and it's been suggested to be abrogated since 2018. There are also conventions number 4, number 41, and these conventions barred women from working at night and in industrial undertakings, and these have also been abrogated. What we see in recent years is that laws and regulations that improve occupational safety and health administration, they have enabled women to enter these high-paying jobs and male-dominated sectors to actually perform these activities and these jobs in a safer environment. So there are several reforms that we observed over the years, and I am going to talk a little bit about those very shortly, that countries not only remove the restrictions to women's jobs, but also introduce these occupational safety and health standards and measures to enhance women's safety in the workforce. So what we find at the end of the day is that eliminating these restrictions and to the types of jobs that women can perform actually encourage more women to participate in the labor force and contribute to their economies, but in a safe way, right? If we see this trend on adopting more occupational safety and health measures, then we enable more women to participate safely in the workforce.
Super. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying that,
Of
Natalia.
course. So moving ahead, we talk about the restrictions that we observed in the data, but removing these restrictions to the works that women can perform is critical because sectoral segregation is closely linked to the gender pay gap, lower salaries for women than for men, and that can also hinder women's ability to advance in their careers. But these legal reforms alone, they're not enough. And in our latest report, we also looked at what supportive frameworks, what needs to be in place that can support legal implementation. And one of the aspects that we identified is the importance of the collection and publication of high quality, quantifiable, sex disaggregated data. This is fundamental to the design of gender smart policies, to monitor progress, and to also understand where the main bottlenecks are. So we see that almost half of the country that we measure, and we measure 190 countries, almost half publish sex disaggregated data on employment in at least 4 of the industries we measure. And I have here on the screen all the industries that we measure, and the countries, the 47% of the countries publish at least in 4 of these industries. There are sex disaggregated data. And data is very relevant for the discussion on women's labor force participation. And again, if we don't take that into consideration, it's impossible for us to understand in which sectors are women actually underrepresented, what is preventing them from entering, and actually what is the effect of the policies or the reforms once they are introduced. So here, also wanted to point out that this data, both on the types of restrictions that are imposed in some countries, but also the availability of sex disaggregated data and other supportive frameworks, is extremely relevant for not only World Bank teams working in operations, but also externally to the World Bank. But I wanted to bring in 2 examples of reforms that we have observed, and these are real life examples, and they were very much in line with the research that we do at Women, Business, and the Law. So the first one, and the more recent one, is a reform done in Azerbaijan with the support from the World Bank. So in 2023, Azerbaijan reformed its laws to repeal restrictions on women working in industrial jobs and jobs deemed dangerous. But prior to this reform, the law restricted women from working in as many as 674 jobs, from transportation to agriculture to the energy sector. And these jobs restrictions, they were inherited from the former Soviet Union legislation, and that prevented women from working as train engineers, bus drivers, and other jobs that were considered potentially hazardous and strenuous. And here, in this case of Azerbaijan, there was also an approach that focused on safety and occupational health, which also enabled women to have more clarity and understanding of some women. And it's important to point out that women who are not pregnant and who are not nursing, these jobs, classifying these the hazardous aspects of certain jobs enable more women to make a choice to either enter that type of sector or not. And another example that we also see was in 2021 in Vietnam. And Vietnam eliminated the restrictions to women's employment and also maintained measures to ensure the occupational health and safety of both men and women. So whereas women who are not pregnant or nursing were previously banned from performing more than 70 specific jobs, which range from drilling, repairing high voltage power lines, these women that are not nursing and are not pregnant can now work in the same job as men. And again, the law in Vietnam also requires that employers ensure occupational safety and health and inform both men and women of the risks that performing certain jobs pose to their reproductive health. Now, I'm coming to an end of my presentation, and I just want to leave everybody with a message. In an era of persistently slow growth, climate challenge, increasing conflict, boosting participation of women in the global workforce could significantly brighten the outlook. Some regions in the world, such as the Middle East and the North Africa and South Asia, could boost their potential GDP growth by as much as 1.2 percentage points a year. And that's by raising female labor force participation rates to the average of all the developing economies. Other research suggests that in OECD countries alone, governments could add 7 trillion to the global economy by closing the gender gap in the workplace and in management. But as we like to say, time is running out. Women can and should be part of the solution. So it's such a great opportunity to be here talking to you, Apurva, and in the Women in Unconventional Jobs podcast about this research and the importance of pushing forward the research agenda, but also the reform agenda that enable more women to join the workforce. So I'm going to end my presentation here. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Great. Thank you, Natalia, for that fantastic presentation. I think we learned so much by just showing, what is the landscape like and the gaps and the important barriers. So you have led research on this report, and I'm sure you've been speaking to multiple governments and organizations. And you did allude and highlight in your presentation about sex aggregated data and how tough it is. Not all, economies end up collecting it. So, can you speak a little bit about, in policy making, in countries and contexts that you might have spoken to, could you please share what do you think are the biggest barriers to obtaining such data?
That's a great question. So sex disaggregated data is like the missing puzzle piece in understanding women's lives, but also women's ability to participate in the economy. And without that, we are not able to pinpoint where gender disparities persist and where more urgent legal and policy actions are needed. There is a great policy note that was published by the World Bank Gender Group recently, and that underscores the critical role of gender data in advancing gender equality. And this note, it also points to challenges across several pillars in terms of gender data, but also sex disaggregated data. And that is on the availability, quality, processing, access, and uptake. So barriers to this type of data may be to lack of funding, or it's very costly to do a data collection. It could be lack of technical capacity or personnel for data collection and analysis. It could also be due to flaws in questionnaire design and respondent selection. There are several factors that may impact or impede the ability of collecting and publishing these data. In many countries, it's possible that they have collected the data on labor force participation, but that data is not sex disaggregated. It could also be that the data is collected, but it's not publicized. So the inability to access the data is also an issue. This data needs to be publicized. It needs to be disseminated. But despite these challenges in obtaining, collecting, and publicizing this data, by bringing to light the importance of sex disaggregated data, we hope that this will inspire countries to take action, seek partnerships, or find ways to make this happen. Because as I mentioned, how can we know the sectors where women are underrepresented? How can we know where more urgent action is needed? If we don't have this data, we can make that assessment. And I also mentioned the example from Chile earlier in the presentation. And again, without sex disaggregated data, how can we keep track of the process of the progress that was made after reforms or policy interventions? So only through a comprehensive data, or only through having the access to this comprehensive data, we can actually and accurately gauge progress and craft targeted, effective policies for a more equitable future.
Great, great. Thank you, Natalia. I think that's very, insightful about what you said. And in part two, as you know, we are going to dive into exactly that, right? We are hoping to speak with policymakers, with, teams that engage with policymakers to understand what is it like on the field and how, we could have more sex aggregated data available, how we could, equalize uh, uh, non-traditional roles professionally for men and female. So thank you again for your time, and we're going to link all the resources related to the 10th edition of the report here. So please stay tuned. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Apurva. It's a pleasure.